The next stitch I'm going to work on is the whip stitch. The whip stitch is a stitch used for many different things to apply something, so a piece of fabric, a piece of lace or decoration on top of your fabric. We often use them in the costume shop to put labels on our garments, so I will show you that as well in just a moment. But first, I'm going to move down here to a pleat I've created. So a pleat is a fold of fabric. This fabric is folded over itself. You can see that there's multiple thicknesses there, and I have pinned it in place so that it doesn't move on me. So I'm pretending that my pleat is the object that I am applying to my other fabric as I move along. The whip stitch is relatively simple. It's the same repetitive motion over and over again. The trick is consistency in the length of stitches, both their depth and their distance apart from each other. So I will show you those things in just a moment. What I'm going to do with my needle is to insert it in what would be the fabric or the garment, and then come up through what I am applying to it. You can see that I've inserted my needle so that it's perpendicular to the line that I am sewing on. It's important to keep the position of the needle in the same place as you progress as well. So I have already pre-knotted my fabric or my thread. You can see that I pulled my knot down to the base of the fabric there, like I have with other stitches. And then when I move down the line, I'm going to try to insert my needle on the same plane and exit on the same plane, as if there were two imaginary dotted lines running down either side of this pleat here. When I pull it flat, you'll see that it makes a natural diagonal on its own. The diagonal is not created by me changing the orientation of my needle. My needle will consistently stay perpendicular to what I am sewing. The diagonal is created through the stitch jumping from one place to another. So again, I'm entering and exiting on the same imaginary line, moving forward on both sides of that pleat. And the consistency comes with keeping your needle in that position, and then also moving about the same distance apart each time you move forward. This one is really repetitive, and once you get the hang of it, it's pretty simple. And you can see that nice little diagonal line that forms once I keep going. So if I were to apply a label to something, I would treat it much in the same fashion. Always make sure that if whatever you're applying is plastic, like these labels are, that you pin it really well, because they can be very slippery and move around on you. So if I were to pin on this label to a garment, hopefully I would pin it somewhere where that fabric was multiple layers. If I have just a single layer of fabric and I'm whip stitching, I will have very large stitches on the back side of the garment. Nobody wants to see that through the clothes. So we often put it in places where there's a double layer of fabric, there's a lining or a facing in the garment, and we apply it there. So you can pin through these labels just like you would fabric. They are plastic, but you can get them to hold in place so they don't scoot around as you sew them. Just like that. So I'm going to jump up here to my label, and I'm going to treat the edge of the label just like I treated the edge of my pleat. So I'm going to insert my needle and then exit in the label itself. You have to push a little bit harder in the plastic label than you do in the fabric alone. And then if I'm moving around the edges of the label, again, inserting and exiting on the same imaginary dotted line you've sort of created for yourself in your head. If I'm changing directions, I don't really have to do anything fancy. All I'm doing is changing the orientation of my needle. I'll take one more stitch before I turn that corner. And then now I've made my needle perpendicular to this edge of the label, whereas I was sewing this direction before. So you can see I'm moving around the edges of the label. I would stitch around as much of the label as possible. It will make it stronger and last longer in the garment so that it is not coming out as the actor is wearing it or as it's in the wash. Occasionally there are circumstances where we can't get around to all four sides. For instance, there's a narrow portion that is double threaded or double layered, excuse me. But we would go around as much space as possible. When I want to knot my thread, I would want to make sure that I'm not trying to make my knot on top of this plastic label. It's not a good place to make the knot. It would be very difficult to do so. So when I'm ready to make my knot, I'm going to make a small stitch outside of the label in the fabric. Pull until it's completely flat. Don't be tempted to use this loop as the loop to tie your thread. That won't work because of the space that I'm jumping across from the label back into the fabric. It's way too great of a distance to do that. So I have to pull all the way flat. Then once I've gotten outside of the label, I'm free to make my really, really small stitch on top. Pull, and when this loop forms, this is now the loop that I can use. I put my needle in the edge of that loop, wrap it around, and then pull until it's flat and makes a secure knot.